an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I want you to think about this. Canadian forestry has a role to play in saving the planet.
Absolutely. The answer is yes.
Welcome to this Story Studio Network podcast series. I'm Dave Trafford. In this series, Aaron Trafford and I will explore a number of ideas that hinge on the notion of Canadian forestry helping to save the world.
There's no path to a net zero carbon economy without the forest sector and forest products, full stop.
We'll talk about how and why Canadian forests have the ability to shift the climate crisis and the economy to build a better future.
There is no machine and no process known to man better than a tree that's sequestering carbon.
We'll explore innovations in forest management that drive a green economy and directly address the climate issue.
We have a significant amount of the world's forest land. With that privilege comes the responsibility of taking care of it.
So welcome in to this special series produced for Forestry for the Future.
Well, here we are, our 12th and final episode of this podcast series, Canadian Forestry Can Save the World.
You know, I did a count, and we've talked to more than, over 30 people, give or take, through the course of the project, and they've all given voice to the stories that shape forestry for the future.
We've had the chance to hear from First Nations and Indigenous leaders who view our relationship with the forests through a traditional, historic, and cultural lens.
Yeah, and the interesting thing for me is to see how that approach would have been dismissed a century ago when the forestry sector was really starting to kick off in this country. And today, the Indigenous model of looking back 7 generations and forward 7 generations is more or less viewed now as best practices by today's forest management specialists.
So just consider the conversations we've had over the course of the last few episodes, talking about the bioeconomy, making not just best use of the wood we harvest, but a complete use of a tree. That's old thinking that informs modern forest management planning.
Yeah, in the last episode, we heard from Derek Nybor and Rosemary Thompson. Derek's the president and CEO at the Forest Product Association of Canada. Rosemary leads the charge for the Coalition for a Better Future. And what's clear here, based on their last report card, is forestry and wood product sector in this country is set to play a major role in ensuring a better future for Canadians and the rest of the world.
So there's no question there's a lot of heavy lifting to be done to achieve those goals. So I think we actually need to take this conversation now outside of the forestry and wood product sector.
Yeah, we've come across some great news stories about the role our forests play in fighting climate change, how the forest and the wood product sector can lead the way as we transition from the fossil fuel-based economy to a greener, planet-friendly economy.
But we've also realized for all the benefits to be celebrated, there are cultural blind spots when it comes to the general public's perceptions of the forest industry.
So here's the question. How does Forestry for the Future translate all of these stories of high-tech innovation and data points that paint a robust economic argument for the development of biofuel products into a broader-based cultural movement? How does the simple idea that every piece of wood you touch, every piece of wood in your home, is storing carbon that's been removed from the atmosphere, how does it become part of that vernacular discussion among the general public?
Well, let's introduce you to Velma McCall.
We're about to have a lively discussion from different perspectives about how we take social license, which is really permission and support in community.
Velma is a principal and national marketplace growth lead at Earnscliffe Strategies, and she led a quite spirited discussion on how the forestry sector can build social license, how to curate and collate these stories we've told in this series,
and translate that into quality, authentic conversations in community, and the kinds of conversations that allow you to do your work. to be supported in doing your work, to be supported in your communities, by your provincial governments and your municipal governments, and at the national level as well. I think what all of this work does is allow you to have quality conversations. It allows you to have conversations that aren't based on misperceptions or old ideas.
Really, what it means is speaking to a new audience. And that audience is you.
And to seek affinity circles, to seek that reinforcement from third parties. In traditional government relations, we would talk about third party advocates, but really those people advocate, they provide affinity for what it is that you're talking about, and they lend credibility to that younger generation that, you're speaking from a place that's deeply rooted.
If you've listened to this series, you'll know my dad was a professional forester. We grew up understanding the importance of the bush. And I came to this project thinking, I had a pretty good handle on the importance of forestry and the sector. But I got to tell you, I learned a lot talking to all the big thinkers and the curious characters who've contributed to this discussion.
Very interesting then to hear Velma's backstory as well and the filter that she brought to this whole social license discussion.
I wanted to say two things to you about why I'm sitting here. The first is that I'm a woman from British Columbia. I grew up in a mining and forestry town. Forestry put food on the table of families that lived close to me, and in a second generation kind of way, they employ people I went to high school with. So I understand what it means to be in community in forestry. And the second reason is because I have worked in the climate change space for more than 20 years. I've worked internationally in a North American sense, domestically and locally on climate change issues. And one of the things that we're talking about is how we bridge the story, as again, 100-year-old story about forestry, into a very modern context, a global context about climate change and SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, something that wouldn't have meant something 20 years ago, but which for a next generation, my daughter included, they are very conversant in SDGs. So that TikTok ad that goes through the 17 ways that forestry is consistent with the SDGs makes forestry relevant to a generation of people who understand them in a way that a lot of other people don't. This is an intergenerational conversation we're also trying to have, because we're trying to have a conversation about something that's been around a long time, but to tell the story in a way that matters to new generations of people, to make forestry more acceptable and to avoid that oppositional dynamic that so often happens around climate change. We're trying to get past that and establish a new base or a new floor for where forestry can start conversations. And that tends to be where you have conversations about social license.
I love that Velma talks about this intergenerational conversation about the forestry story. It turns out you and I have had our own intergenerational conversation throughout this whole project.
Yeah, started with my dad. Bridging the story of an ancient resource, really, the centuries-old forest, to the immediate and the urgent need to address climate change and the shifting global economy.
So let's eavesdrop a little bit more on this social license discussion.
So in addition to Velma, Eric Miller is president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group.
We are in a moment now where social license is integral in whatever you do.
Paul Robitaille is founder and CEO of Advocates Strategies and the Senior Indigenous Relations Advisor to SFI and Project Learning Tree Canada.
Using your communications to do good can do just as much for you to build social license as using your communications to talk about the good you're doing.
And freelance journalist and senior counsel at Sussex Strategy Group in Toronto, Sean McCarthy, brings an important perspective to this conversation about social license.
As a journalist, I will admit I approach these things skeptically.
Now, Sean's one of our people. We're all journalists. And he makes an important point around the language that is being used when we talk about social license.
I mean, he effectively wants you to show your work, as it were. And that goes beyond the glossy photos and the beautifully produced videos and podcasts.
I used to be told by the oil industry, as I covered them a lot, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Well, that's not true. In fact, we are entitled to our own facts. We choose the facts we want to put forward, and we downplay the facts that we don't want people to focus on. So as a journalist, I want to know what is the reality on the ground.
Exactly. If Forestry for the Future, or any other group for that matter, is going to successfully engage the public and policymakers to reinforce forestry's place in the future of our economy and the future of the planet, then you better be prepared to answer Sean's questions and support the discussion with evidence-based science, best practices, and of course, context.
Yeah, and it really is all about establishing two things: credibility and accountability.
Having targets, and having targets that are scientifically based, that is, that they refer back to all of the science around climate change and biodiversity loss and species at risk and all the other things that people care about when they talk about forests. Having those targets embedded in the company's operations, so that when the board meets, it's on the agenda. When the CFO has to do his accounting and filings to the various regulatory agencies, it is included and accounted for. And all these things add to credibility.
Accountability and credibility. Both will be tested by any good journalist, and there'll also be points of argument or questions posed by mission-driven non-governmental organizations working in the forestry or the environmental space.
I realize that the media gets criticized for wanting conflict, but conflict is there. And everybody, whether it's the journalist or the NGO, is going to be looking for holes in your story. So you better have the story down pat. It's part of what you need to do. But it's only part of what you need to do. You need the fundamentals in place in order to make that credible and have it stand upon examination.
So the point Sean's making is really important here. I mean, the homework needs to be done well before the public engagement starts. I mean, anticipating the questions and the opposition, testing the facts and claims. So that comes down to building solid foundations of research and fact-finding before ever crafting a thorough overarching communication strategy. And part of that strategy is community engagement. It's this pursuit of what we're calling social license.
So let's take Sean's advice to heart. Social license can only be built on that foundation of evidence-based science, supportable facts, research. As he says, that's just the beginning, and then comes community engagement.
So we've already heard from Eric Miller at Rideau Potomac Strategy Group. Social license is vital for any successful project that involves community.
You see it in terms of how institutions conduct themselves, how political leaders, how university professors, how everybody that you will come across, there needs to be a certain legitimacy about what you're doing and the values that you're promoting. And so when I think about forestry, my first takeaway is forestry can solve many of the problems that Canada has. Housing is fundamental. It is something that we need to look at and to build new units, to get new people into it. And there's a lot that goes into it, from land use regulations to other sorts of things. But being able to do this, not only to build more, but to build better, is fundamental. And building with wood and not building with steel and concrete, which account for 13% of carbon emissions globally.
yes, a statistic, but a very relevant statistic, is something that I think is really, really important. And then I do a lot of work internationally, and one of the things that nobody seems to understand outside of Canada, and this is not said that much, is that Canada's area of forest, the percentage of its forest, which is third-party certified sustainable, so this is not the industry or the government or somebody else. These are people who look at the health of forests, working forests, and they say, is this sustainable or not? Canada has more than 4 times the percentage of its forest, which is third-party certified sustainable, than anywhere else in the world. So it has about 40%, and the next closest is Russia at 9%. And you can imagine how Russia's forest monitoring is progressing these days. And so you have a lot of things to talk about and to tell this story. And this is not a case of somebody who is trying to embellish a story. It's a story that's been undertold. And it is really at the heart of a lot of what we do. And then having written and thought a lot about these issues, the one thing that also we don't talk enough about is about innovation. So, strange story, back a few years ago, I did do some work in the cosmetic space. I'm not a natural cosmetics user, but it was very exciting to find out that a lot of the things that my wife, and I suppose in a few years when my daughter gets old enough, my daughter will use, can be made out of forest products. And so there's all sorts of really interesting, innovative uses. And the last one I'll leave you with is infrastructure. So we see the need to rebuild a lot of Canada's infrastructure. And there's a bridge in rural Nova Scotia called the Roger Bacon Bridge. And it's like a bridge you would find in any part of Canada in a rural area. And it needed to be replaced. But what they decided to do this time was to replace it using mass timber instead of the traditional steel and concrete. And the project ended up costing about 1/4 of what it would normally cost, because it turns out that wood is a lot lighter than steel and concrete. So they could reuse the footings. They just did a little bit of upgrading. They had this bridge, which was frankly beautiful and certainly much more attractive than you would have gotten, and you're saving money. So this is about asking the question of how can we use wood to solve problems that we're not using it for today. And so when you show the possibilities, whether it's cosmetics, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's housing, you are left with a world of possibilities. And to me, talking about those world of possibilities and how they translate to people's real lives is fundamental.
Talking about the world of possibilities is critical, and I dare say, I think that's been the tone of our conversation over the course of this entire series. I want to come back to something we heard Paul Robitaille say.
Using your communications to do good can do just as much for you to build social license as using your communications to talk about the good you're doing.
Using your communications to do good is just as important in building social license as it is to talk about the good you do. He had a great anecdote to illustrate that point.
Recently, I had the privilege of attending a live taping of the Paul Wells podcast show, it was really great. He was interviewing Minister Miller, who for those that don't know is the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. That event, as you can imagine, it was at the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. It's attended by Ottawa political elite types, I guess, to use that term, if that is one. National Indigenous leaders were in the room. A lot of really influential folks in Indigenous economic development and capacity building, movers and shakers in a variety of ways. The title sponsor of that event was TELUS. who most, I'm sure, are pretty familiar with. And as that title sponsor, as is often the case, they had the opportunity to get up and share, a message. They had the opportunity to communicate with this really, important group, who I'm sure they really have an interest in connecting with. Now, they could have got up there, given the topic of the day and said, look at us, look how great we're reconciling, all of this kind of stuff, right? And really boosted their reputation, in that sort of way. But they didn't do that. Instead, one of their VPs got up and just said, we're really proud to be part of this, but what we think is more important is to hear from others. So on the screen that was in the room, they showed a really amazing video that was produced by the Moosehide campaign. And you might be familiar with that. It's a national campaign to really engage men in ending violence against Indigenous women and girls. And, having watched that video and the great work, and of course they acknowledged TELUS in it, I walked away not knowing the first thing about what TELUS does in Indigenous relations. But I walked away with the impression that if their conduct in this room today and the way that they approach this communications opportunity is emblematic of how they simply conduct themselves as an organization and the values that they hold, well, that's the kind of partner that maybe I would want to work with. That is the kind of partner I'm going to tell, folks in my networks within Indigenous communities about, because they seem to conduct their work in a good way.
Yeah, it's not simply now a comm strategy, right? It really comes down to this expression of values and value alignment with the community.
I think what you're starting to see is the translation of this, all of these different places that you're telling your story now translates into community. The conversations in community are what lead to social license. It may seem overly simplistic to put it like that, but anybody who's ever been at a set of regulatory hearings knows that the quality of the conversation that you have in community makes all the difference to whether that regulatory approval goes ahead or not.
We're in an age where it's got to be authentic. A real life example of how wood actually positively impacts the economy of Canada. And you take that same principle when you're dealing with other questions around sustainability.
Social license needs to be based on authenticity, on real experience, real stories about real people.
Yeah, so only reinforcing what we heard Sean say about the need to establish credibility and accountability.
All right. But let's put our skeptical journo cap back on just for a hot minute. If all these efforts to build social license in the forestry and environmental space have an inauthentic whiff about them, if the facts fail to stand up to scrutiny, organizations can then quickly be accused of just sort of ticking boxes.
Yeah, we call that greenwashing. I'm sure you've heard the phrase. And it often comes up in all these conversations about carbon offsets and emission reductions associated with nature-based solutions that are targeting the climate crisis. Being seen to do good work without doing good work for doing what's best for the planet.
The Guardian had a series of articles late last year, I think it was, about some of the voluntary credit markets where they're buying forest preservation conservation projects, and the numbers around it and the analytics behind it were questionable. And I'm told that the voluntary market has been really badly impacted by that negative news around, is this greenwashing? And it's the hardest question I think a lot of the nature-based solutions faces, but the opportunity is real, and we need to talk about opportunities, whether in the Indigenous community or in the broader economy. We need to talk about economic opportunity and jobs, as well as risk and peril when we're talking about climate change, nature loss, and biodiversity.
Sean's right. Again, this whole issue of greenwashing easily distracts from, and in fact diminishes, efforts to build the ever-important social license. The lack of authenticity leaves the door wide open for skepticism to turn into dismissiveness. And that lands any social license campaign on shaky ground. So again, authenticity is important.
Frankly, that's the only way to focus on the real risks, the real challenges, the real opportunities, particularly for the forestry sector.
And Paul Robitaille will tell you many of those larger long-term benefits and the opportunities are found in Indigenous communities.
Indigenous peoples across, what's now Canada represent about 5% of the population, right? But I would argue that they punch far above that number when it comes to a say in what happens in the forest, right? And rightfully so, as the First Peoples and inherent rights holders and those who should, I would argue, have underlying jurisdiction on those lands. But they also, I think, punch far above that number in terms of sort of the moral, suasion they have within the general Canadian public, right? They are a very important group. And what we've seen over decades now through the work of nations themselves is that the forests have been a place where Indigenous peoples have been asserting sovereignty and exercising their inherent right to self-determination and, maintaining those relationships with the environment around them, the forest around them, to solve the solutions to the really pressing issues in their communities, whether it be energy dependence, right? And for northern communities, that can be reducing reliance on diesel fuel or faulty power grids, right? Housing crises, food sovereignty, language retention, all of these different things. Forests have played a role. And I just happen to think one of the ancillary benefits as nations have asserted more of that sovereignty and through that, grown capacity and become more sophisticated in their operations where they now are integrated throughout the broader forest-based economy, whether it be through their own operations or joint ventures or partnerships, is now, one of those benefits to the world now is their acts of self-determination in their territories are actually leading to some of these global, solutions. And I think there's a really powerful story there that we can communicate, connecting like the local to the global when it comes to nature-based benefits. And I think if we started doing a better job of really telling that story in simple and compelling ways that's grounded in the voices of people who are doing these things and really benefiting everyone, then I think, we can all move forward in a really good way for the broader sector.
Paul's perspective paints a really powerful story that doesn't just bridge the story of the centuries-old forests to the immediate and urgent need to address climate change and our shifting global economy, but it's linked to the self-determination of Indigenous people.
And to that end, Sean makes the point that in order to build and develop social license in these communities, we need to be more precise in our language and how we describe the role and the place of First Nations.
I think we have come to the point, I wouldn't say everybody has reached this point, but the conversations around stakeholders versus right holders. Indigenous communities across this country are not stakeholders, they're rights holders. And their free, prior, and informed consent is required for anything any company wants to do on Indigenous land that affects their rights. And I think that's a given. And I also think that it is something that Canadians understand increasingly and support. So as you're trying to connect with that broader audience and achieve social license, I think that's an important part of the mix.
Indigenous communities aren't stakeholders. They're rights holders. Words matter.
Yeah. And the words we speak matter in developing social license. But Velma picked up on a point we touched on at the top of this episode.
We're talking about segmentation across generations. Indigenous people start at a 7-generation worldview in so many of their approaches to these things, which is why they do have a much more sophisticated ecosystem understanding of the land than a lot of people maybe who live in urban centers or might. So that's important.
The Indigenous nations view their relationship with the planet over 14 generations. 7 generations back, 7 generations forward. And Velma's right, not just because of its inherent wisdom, but because it illustrates the other side of the communications formula, listening. There can be no effective communication without active, effective listening.
Absolutely. We cannot possibly tell authentic, credible stories if we're not good listeners. Then, the more I think about it, the whole concept of building social license through communications is what we like to call our audience-first approach to shows just like this one.
You're right. I mean, the success of a podcast like Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is directly related to making the show about you, about the audience. Your curiosity's piqued, your questions are answered, you've learned something new, you're excited to tell others about what you've discovered.
So in the end, really, I guess this series has been our own little exercise in building social license. We've done a lot of talking and a whole lot more listening. And we hope we've challenged and enlightened and maybe even opened your mind to a world of possibilities and opportunities.
And that includes understanding that you play an important role in saving the planet when you do something as simple as buy a wood product, or you and the kids are out in the yard planting a tree.
We hope you've enjoyed this Story Studio Network series and would love it if you'd leave us a comment and a rating wherever you listen to the show.
So for Aaron and our producer Becky Coles, along with the small but mighty team at SSN, thanks for listening. This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This
is SSN.